What would you do if the key to your future was locked inside a box that everyone said was worthless? What if you had to spend every last dollar you had in the world to claim it, enduring the laughter and scorn of an entire town? This was the choice that fell to Etta Briggs, a young woman of 20, who, at a rowdy frontier auction, paid $90 for a sealed Outlaw's Strongbox. The whole town laughed, but what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that the box held a secret, far more valuable than gold, a legacy that would not only change her life, but the future of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Etta Briggs and the Outlaw's last gamble. Etta stood at the back of the crowded auction house in Copper Gulch, a ghost in her own life. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies, a scent she had come to associate with public judgment. Just an hour earlier, the auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a stained waistcoat, had sold off her father's belongings: his worn pickaxe, his dented tin coffee pot, his bedroll, his spare shirt, the collection of a life spent chasing a dream into the hard granite of the earth, all sold for a pittance that barely covered the undertaker's bill. She clutched the meager roll of bills in her pocket, the sum total of her inheritance, $97. Her father, Thomas Briggs, had been a good man, a quiet man, whose hands were maps of hard labor. He had come to this rough-edged town with a hope as bright and sharp as a new shovel, and he had left it in a plain pine box, his lungs full of the same dust he'd spent a decade trying to sift gold from. His death had left Etta utterly alone, an island of quiet grief, in a sea of loud, ambitious men. The town looked at her with a mixture of pity and dismissal. She was just another prospector's orphan, another piece of driftwood the frontier tide would soon wash away. She was only here to collect the final coins from her father's scattered life, and then she would have to decide which direction to walk, until her shoes or her spirit gave out. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, none of them truly seeing her. They saw her loss, her vulnerability, and in a town like Copper Gulch, that was the same as seeing a weakness to be exploited or ignored. The auction was nearing its end, the auctioneer's voice growing hoarse. "All right, folks, last item of the day, a real piece of Copper Gulch history." Two burly men grunted as they hauled a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox onto the stage. It was ugly, scarred, and banded with rust that bled like old wounds onto the dark, warped wood. This, gentlemen, was the property of the late, not-so-great One-Eyed Jack Callahan. A ripple of dark amusement went through the crowd. Callahan had been a local terror for a few years, a highwayman known more for his bluster than his success. He'd been caught a month back after a botched stagecoach robbery and hanged from the big cottonwood outside of town. Sealed tighter than a miser's fist, the auctioneer bellowed, rapping his knuckles on the iron. Keys long gone, probably at the bottom of the Black Creek with Jack's other eye. What's inside? Could be gold, could be rocks. Who wants to pay for a mystery? A few miners shouted joke bids. 2 bits! A bottle of whiskey! Silas Croft, a bull of a man who owned the biggest ranch in the county, laughed from the front row. "I'll give you $5 for the firewood," he roared, and his cronies howled with him. Etta watched, her mind numb. She was about to turn and leave, to slip out the back door and into the anonymity of the dusty street, when a memory surfaced, faint as a puff of smoke. It was her father, a few weeks before he died, sitting by the stove. He'd been reading a tattered newspaper article about Callahan's capture. "That man," her father had murmured, more to himself than to her. "They got the story all wrong. He wasn't looking for what they think." The memory was a splinter, sharp and insistent. It made no sense. But her father had been a keen observer of the world, a man who saw the grain in the wood and the truth in a man's eyes. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, a surge of something that felt like defiance, Etta heard her own voice, quiet but clear in the boisterous room. $10. The crowd went silent, heads turned. Silas Croft squinted, then a slow, mocking grin spread across his face. "Well, well, the little Briggs girl feels lucky." $15, he boomed. 20, Etta said, her heart starting to pound. She didn't look at Croft. She looked at the box. Croft was playing with her now, enjoying the show. 30. The crowd was murmuring, laughing. Etta took a breath. 50. A gasp went through the room. This was no longer a joke. Silas Croft's eyes narrowed. He was a man who hated to be challenged, especially by a woman, and most especially by a girl with nothing to her name. 75, he snapped. The auctioneer's eyes darted between them, sensing real money. Etta felt a cold calm settle over her. She thought of her father's knowing words, of the pitying looks, of the $97 in her pocket. 90, she said, her voice steady. The word hung in the air. $90. An absurd sum for a locked box of unknown contents. Silas Croft stared at her for a long moment, then threw his head back and laughed. A loud, cruel sound that filled the entire building. Let her have it. The girl's bought herself the most expensive box of dirt in the territory. The auctioneer, seeing his chance was gone, banged his gavel. Sold, for $90 to Miss Etta Briggs. The room erupted in laughter as she walked forward, her face a pale mask, and counted out almost every dollar she had in the world. Why would a young woman with nothing spend everything on a locked box? What was the memory that drove her to such a fool's errand? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find inside, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage on the frontier. Now, as the laughter followed her out of the auction house, Etta had to face the terrifying weight of what she had done. The strongbox was heavier than it looked, a dead, stubborn weight that fought her with every step. Getting it out of the auction house was an ordeal in itself, a slow, scraping journey across the plank floorboards, under the amused gaze of the lingering crowd. No one offered to help. They just watched, some shaking their heads, others smirking, as she half-dragged, half-carried her ridiculous purchase toward the door. Once outside, the afternoon sun was a white glare, making the dust of the main street into a shimmering haze. Men leaning against the posts of the saloon and the general store stopped their conversations to watch her struggle past. They tipped their hats, but their smiles were wide and mocking. Got yourself a real treasure there, Miss Briggs, one of them called out. Don't spend it all in one place. Laughter followed, sharp and dismissive. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, on the rickety external staircase that led to her rented room above the mercantile. Her world had shrunk to this single, punishing task, moving this iron-bound burden from a place of public humiliation to one of private reckoning. From the swinging doors of the saloon, Silas Croft's voice carried, loud and self-satisfied, as he recounted the tale for those who had missed it. $90 for a box of rocks. I tell you, that girl's grief has turned her mind. Thomas Briggs spent his life chasing fool's gold, and it seems his daughter has inherited the fever. More laughter. The town had already written its story about her. She was the foolish, grieving girl who threw away her last pennies on a dead outlaw's junk. As she neared the livery stable, a figure straightened up from mending a harness in the shade of the overhang. It was Samuel, the old Ute stable hand. He was a man of few words and deep-set eyes, a fixture in Copper Gulch who seemed to exist outside its noisy social currents. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He looked at her face, then down at the scarred strongbox she was wrestling with. Etta tensed, expecting another jeer, perhaps a quieter, more pitying version. Instead, he simply met her gaze and spoke, his voice low and raspy like stones grinding together. Some locks, he said, aren't made for keys. He held her eyes for a moment longer, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his own, then turned back to his work, leaving Etta standing in the dust, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. Just then, Silas Croft himself, smelling of whiskey and arrogance, stepped out of the saloon, blocking her path. He loomed over her, a mountain of smug satisfaction. Well, Miss Briggs, he drawled, looking down at the strongbox. You planning on prying that open right here on the street? Let us all have a look at Jack Callahan's vast treasure. Or are you afraid we'll all die of envy when you show us his collection of rusty nails and dust? Etta said nothing. There were no words that would make a difference. She clutched the rough handle of the box tighter, her knuckles white, and sidestepped him, her gaze fixed on the stairs just ahead. His contemptuous chuckle followed her as she began the slow, arduous climb. Each step was a fresh wave of humiliation. Each creak of the wooden stairs a new note in the chorus of mockery. The journey up the stairs was the longest of Etta's life. With each step, the iron-strapped box seemed to gain weight, absorbing all the doubt and regret that swirled inside her. When she finally reached the landing and fumbled the key into the lock of her room, her arms were trembling with exhaustion. The room was small and spare, little more than a cell. It held a narrow cot, a washbasin on a rickety stand, a single wooden chair, and a small window that looked out onto the dusty, sun-baked alley below. It was a temporary place, a room that held its breath, waiting for its occupant to move on. She maneuvered the strongbox through the doorway and let it fall to the floor. It landed with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to shake the entire building, a sound of finality. Silence descended, broken only by her own ragged breathing. In the quiet of the room, the box looked even more formidable, more hopeless. The last light of the day slanted through the grimy window pane, a single bar of gold that illuminated the pitted rust and the deep scars in the wood. It was an object of pure, brute utility, built to withstand anything, especially the hopes of a girl with $90 to her name. She circled it like a wary animal. There was no obvious keyhole, only a tight, sealed seam where the lid met the body. The iron straps were thick and bolted down with heavy, rounded rivets. She pushed on the lid. It didn't budge. She tried to find purchase with her fingers along the seam, but it was sealed tight by age and rust. It was, for all intents and purposes, a solid block of wood and iron. The town's laughter echoed in her ears, louder now, in the suffocating silence. Croft's mocking voice, the whispers, the pitying stares. A wave of crushing despair washed over her. What had she done? She had traded the last vestiges of her father's life, the last of her security, for a useless, ugly lump. She sank onto the cot, her face in her hands. The impulse that had seized her in the auction house now felt like a fever dream, a moment of madness. She was a fool. Her father had been a dreamer, and he had died with nothing. She was her father's daughter, chasing a ghost story into ruin. She sat there for a long time, as the light faded from the room, turning the gold bar to a soft gray, then to nothing. The box was just a hulking shadow on the floor. Eventually, hunger gnawed at her. She lit a single kerosene lantern, its flickering light casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. She ate her meager supper of dry bread and a strip of jerky, her eyes never leaving the box. It had a presence now, a silent, stubborn challenge. It was a monument to her folly, sitting in the very center of her tiny, empty world. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep on the cot. It felt too far away. She pulled her thin blanket onto the floor and lay down beside the strongbox, her hand resting on its cold, rough surface. She felt the texture of the pitted iron, the grain of the ancient wood. She listened to the silence of the town, settling into sleep, and she listened to the silence of the box, wondering if it held anything at all. The next morning, Etta woke with the first pale light, her back stiff from the hard floorboards. The clarity of dawn brought with it a renewed, if fragile sense of purpose. The despair of the previous night had receded, replaced by a quiet, stubborn resolve. She had made this bed, and now she would lie in it, or, rather, she would find a way to break it open. She made a small, weak coffee on her little stove and knelt beside the strongbox again. This time, she would not just look at it, she would study it. Her father had taught her that. He had been a prospector, but he had the patience of a watchmaker. The secrets are always in the small things, Etta, he used to say, showing her the subtle shift in color in a rock that hinted at a vein of ore. You just have to learn how to see. She ran her calloused fingertips over every inch of its surface, closing her eyes to better feel the landscape of its history. She traced the gouges and dents, the splintered edges, the rough texture of the rusted iron straps. She wasn't just looking for a way in, She was looking for a story. And then, she felt it. Along the bottom edge of one of the horizontal iron straps, near a corner, the texture was different. The rust here was flakier, less deeply pitted, as if it had been protected from the worst of the elements. Her fingers detected a series of tiny, almost imperceptible scratches beneath the corrosion. These were not the random scars of a rough life. They were too regular, too deliberate. Her heart gave a small, hopeful flutter. Using her thumbnail, she carefully scraped away a flake of rust. Underneath, preserved in the dark metal, was a tiny, exquisitely etched symbol. It was a flower, a delicate 5-petaled bloom with a gracefully curving stem, no bigger than her nail. It was a thing of impossible artistry and gentleness on this brutal, masculine object. Outlaws and highwaymen dealt in skulls, daggers, and threats. They did not deal in flowers. This single, beautiful detail refused to fit the narrative of one-eyed Jack Callahan. It was a wrong note in a song she thought she knew. It was a whisper that contradicted the town's loud, confident laughter. She remembered Samuel's words from the day before, spoken so quietly in the dust outside the livery. Some locks aren't made for keys. She looked at the box with new eyes. She had been searching for a keyhole, a conventional weakness, a place to insert a tool and force a victory. But the flower suggested a different kind of thinking. It wasn't an invitation to brute force. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle. Perhaps the lock wasn't a single mechanism, but the entire design. Maybe the way in wasn't through the seam at all. She moved to the other corners, her fingers now searching with specific intent. It took time, but she found them. Beneath the rust on the other 3 corners, hidden under the iron straps, were more symbols, each one as finely etched as the first. A leaf with delicate veins, a curling tendril, and finally, a swollen seed pod ready to burst. A progression. The life cycle of a plant, rendered in miniature on the cage of a dead man's secrets. The discovery of the symbols changed everything. This was no longer a matter of brute force. It was a puzzle to be solved. Etta retrieved her father's old tool roll from her meager pack. It wasn't much, just a heavy-headed hammer, a cold chisel with a blunted tip, and a long, thin file. Tools for persuading rock, not for delicate work. She hesitated. The thought of scarring the box, of damaging the beautiful, hidden etchings, felt like a sacrilege, but she had no other choice. The town's laughter still rang in her ears, a goad to action. She had to know what was inside. She decided to start near the corner, with the seed pod symbol, the end of the plant's cycle. She positioned the tip of the chisel against the edge of the iron strap, just beside the etching. Her father's old dog, a scruffy gray mutt named Dust, who had been his constant shadow, lifted his head from the cot. He watched her with tired, intelligent eyes, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the thin mattress. Etta took a deep breath and struck the head of the chisel with the hammer. The sound was deafening in the small room, a sharp, metallic ring that vibrated through the floorboards. Dust whined softly, a low note of protest. The blow did little more than chip the rust and leave a small, bright mark on the dark iron. She struck it again, and again, falling into a rhythm. It was grueling, punishing labor. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. Her arm, unused to such repetitive strain, began to ache with a deep, burning fire. The iron was stubborn, unforgiving, yielding only in tiny, grudging flakes. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, turning her little room into an oven. Dust moved from the cot to the sliver of shade under the window, his panting a soft counterpoint to the sharp ring of the hammer. He was her only audience, the silent keeper of her lonely vigil, his steadfast presence, a comforting link to the quiet, determined man who had raised him. Every time her resolve wavered, every time the pain in her arm and back screamed at her to stop, she would look at the dog, and then at the etched flower, and she would pick up the hammer again. She wasn't just fighting with a box. She was fighting against the judgment of an entire town, against the specter of her own failure. As she worked her way around the box, a pattern began to emerge. The straps were not all identical. The rivets near the symbols felt different under the chisel, less solid. She stopped trying to pry the lid and focused her efforts on the straps themselves. They were not just bands to hold the box together. She was now certain they were the mechanism of the lock itself. The symbols were the key, a map to its secrets. She began to tap gently around the rivets, listening to the sound, feeling the vibration. She was no longer just a girl with a hammer. She was becoming a safecracker, learning a language of iron, rust, and hidden pins. Her hands, already calloused from a life of hard work, began to blister, but she barely noticed. She was close. She could feel it. The box was beginning to speak to her. After what felt like an eternity of chipping and tapping, her hands raw and streaked with rust and blood, she found it. Near the seed pod symbol, one of the large, rounded rivets was not a rivet at all. It was a cap, cleverly disguised to look like the others. Her chisel had knocked it just enough to reveal a hairline crack around its circumference. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She set aside the hammer and chisel and picked up the thin, pointed file. With the delicacy of a surgeon, she worked the tip of the file into the tiny crack. She wiggled it, gently at first, then with more pressure. There was a faint click, a sound so small it was almost lost in the silence of the room, and the iron strap beside the seed pod sprang loose with a groan. It wasn't riveted. It had been held by a hidden, spring-loaded pin. A wave of triumphant energy surged through her. She was no longer guessing. She knew the secret now. She moved to the next symbol, the tendril, and found a similar hidden pin. Then the leaf. Then, finally, the flower. Each one released its strap in sequence, following the life cycle of the plant. The box wasn't locked by a key, but by a story. A natural progression that had to be followed in the correct order. With the last strap hanging loose, the heavy lid was finally free. It sat there, unadorned, its purpose served. The box was open. Etta sank back on her heels, her breath catching in her throat. The moment felt sacred. Dust, sensing the shift in the room, got up from his cool spot on the floor and came to her side, nudging her sore hand with his wet nose, as if to say, "We did it." She took a deep, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of rust and her own exertion. Reaching out with trembling hands, she placed them on the edges of the lid and lifted. It came up with a soft groan of protest from the warped, ancient wood. The air that escaped from within was not the stale, musty smell of neglect she expected. It was the dry, clean scent of old paper, of well-tanned leather, and something else, a faint, herbal fragrance like a meadow after a summer rain. She peered inside. There was no gold, no silver coins, no jewels, no bundled stacks of banknotes from a stagecoach robbery. The sight that met her eyes was far more astonishing. The box was lined with faded, dark blue velvet. It was not a cache, it was a cabinet. On top, resting on a bed of dried herbs, lay a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it were dozens of small packets, neatly wrapped in oilskin, tied with twine, and labeled with a delicate, precise script. And nestled in a specially carved compartment in the corner was a set of small, beautiful tools made of brass and glass. A powerful magnifying lens, a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, and a tiny, elegant scale for weighing grams and ounces. This was not the strongbox of a brutish outlaw. This was the portable laboratory of a scholar. With reverent hands, she lifted out the journal. The leather was supple and worn smooth with use. She opened it to the first page. The script was elegant, flowing, the work of a highly educated hand. It read, "The collected notes and field studies of John C. Alleman, botanist." Not One-Eyed Jack Callahan. It was a different name, a different man, a different world. The outlaw persona had been a disguise. Flipping through the pages, Etta saw breathtakingly detailed drawings of plants, flowers, and fungi, each one rendered with artistic and scientific precision. Beside each drawing were pages of dense notes on their properties, their habitats, and maps, crude but accurate, of the high mountain valleys and hidden canyons around Copper Gulch where they had been found. One-Eyed Jack Callahan, the bungling highwayman, was a fiction. John C. Alleman, the brilliant scientist, was the truth locked inside. Etta spent the rest of the night lost in the pages of the journal, the single lantern casting a pool of warm light on the floor of her small room. John Alleman's story unfolded, not in tales of robbery and violence, but in quiet, passionate observations of the natural world. He was a man obsessed with the hidden life of the mountains, a scientist who had adopted the guise of an outlaw to move through the rough territory without attracting the wrong kind of attention. A botanist, carrying delicate instruments, would be a target. A feared highwayman was left alone. His notes detailed the discovery of dozens of plant species, previously unknown to science, many of them unique to the unique geology of the Copper Gulch region. Some had unusual properties, catalogued with meticulous care, but one plant, in particular, dominated the final section of the journal. He called it Silphium eris, or the copper vein bloom. It was a small, hardy flower, with 5 delicate, copper-colored petals, that grew only in soil, with high concentrations of copper ore. Alleman believed its roots absorbed the metal and transformed it into a compound with profound medicinal potential. His research suggested it could treat chronic lung ailments, the miner's cough that had taken her own father and so many others. The oilskin packets contained his life's work, carefully pressed samples of each plant, and most precious of all, vials filled with their seeds. This wasn't just a collection of a hobbyist. It was a potential cure, a botanical treasure of immeasurable value. As the first hint of dawn began to gray the sky outside her window, a fierce storm broke over the town. The wind rose to a howl, and rain began to lash against the glass in violent sheets. Suddenly, a crash from the mercantile below, followed by panicked shouting. A lantern must have overturned. Smoke, acrid and black, began to seep up through the cracks in her floorboards. Fire. Panic seized the street below. Men were shouting, trying to form a bucket brigade in the torrential rain. Etta's first primal instinct was to save the box. She slammed the journal shut, ready to gather everything and flee. This was her vindication, her inheritance, her future. But then she heard a child's terrified cry from the room across the narrow hall. It was the Millers, the mercantile owner, his wife, and their 2 small children. They were trapped. A terrible choice confronted her, in that smoke-filled moment. Save the discovery that could change her life, or save the lives of the neighbors, who had likely laughed at her, along with everyone else. It was no choice at all. Her father had taught her that you measure a person not by what they find, but by what they refuse to leave behind. She shoved a wet rag from her wash basin under her door to buy a few seconds, then threw it open and plunged into the choking hallway. She found Mrs. Miller and her 2 children huddled together, disoriented and crying. Etta grabbed the woman's arm. "The back stairs!" she yelled over the roar of the fire. She guided the terrified family through the blinding smoke, shielding the smallest child with her own body, until they stumbled out onto the rickety external staircase and down into the muddy, rain-swept alley. The moment they were clear, a section of the roof above the hallway collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris down, completely blocking the way back to her room. From the relative safety of the street, Etta turned and looked up in horror. Orange flames were now licking hungrily at the frame of her window. The box, the journal, the seeds, everything she had just discovered, everything she had sacrificed for, was being consumed. Silas Croft and a crowd of townsfolk stood watching, their faces lit by the hellish glow, helpless against the combined fury of the fire and the storm. The storm that fed the fire also, in the end, helped to kill it. By sunrise, the torrential rain had subsided to a miserable drizzle, and the mercantile was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. Etta stood in the muddy street, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, staring at the ruin. The place where her room had been was a gaping, charred hole open to the gray sky. Everything was gone. The box, the journal, the hope. It had all been turned to ash. The town that had mocked her now looked at her with a new, sober expression. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, their children clinging to them, approached her. Their faces were smudged with soot, their eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "You saved us," Mr. Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. Our home, our business, it's all gone. But you saved my family. We owe you everything. He put his arm around Etta, and for the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone. The whispers that followed her now were different. They were not of ridicule, but of awe. Silas Croft, his usual arrogance washed away by the night's events, walked over to her. He looked from her pale, tired face to the burned-out building. "That was a brave thing you did, miss," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Leaving your property to save them. Foolish, maybe, but brave." He didn't mention the Strongbox. He didn't have to. Everyone assumed it had been destroyed, its mysterious contents, whatever they were, lost forever. A crew of volunteers began the grim work of sifting through the wreckage, looking for anything salvageable. Hours later, a man's shout cut through the quiet sounds of their labor. "Over here! Found something!" He was standing in the far corner of what had been Etta's room, a part of the floor that had collapsed but not completely burned through. The men pulled away charred beams and debris, and there, sitting in a crater of its own making, was the Strongbox. It was blackened, scorched, the wood deeply charred, but its iron straps had held. The intense heat had warped the lid, sealing it shut again, but the box itself was miraculously intact. The men let out a cheer as they carefully lowered it to the street with ropes and set it at Etta's feet. A few days later, the circuit doctor, a calm, educated man from the East named Adams, rode into town. He heard the story of the fire, of Etta's bravery, and of the mysterious outlaw's box that had survived the blaze. Intrigued, he sought her out. Etta, who was now staying with the grateful Miller family, had managed to pry the box open again. She showed Dr. Adams the journal and the carefully preserved specimens. As he turned the pages of the journal and examined the plant samples with his magnifying lens, his professional calm gave way to visible excitement. "My dear girl," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that silenced the curious onlookers who had gathered. "Do you have any idea what this is? This isn't the work of an outlaw. This is the work of a genius. John Alleman. I've read his monographs. He was a brilliant botanist from the Eastern Academies, presumed lost on an expedition out west years ago. This discovery, this collection, my God, this could change medicine in the territory." The townspeople stared, first at the doctor, then at Etta, then at the open box. The outlaw's $90 box of rocks was a treasure after all, but of a kind none of them could ever have imagined. The news of Alamon's discovery, and of Etta's role in preserving it, spread far faster than the fire had. Dr. Adams sent letters, carried by the next stagecoach, to his colleagues at universities and scientific societies back east. Within weeks, replies began to arrive, filled with excitement and offers of funding for a proper study of the plants. Copper Gulch, the town that had been the site of Etta's humiliation, transformed into the seat of her vindication. The people who had once laughed at her foolishness now looked upon her as a kind of hero, a custodian of a miracle. One afternoon, Silas Croft, the man who had led the chorus of mockery, sought her out. He was humbled, his usual bluster replaced by a grudging respect. He took her to a small, fertile plot of land he owned just outside of town, where a clear creek ran through a meadow. "This is yours now," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eye, the deeds being filed at the clerk's office. "It needs a garden, so that man's work, so it doesn't die." Etta didn't sell Alamon's collection, despite the generous offers that came in the mail. She understood, with a clarity that felt inherited from her father, that she was not the owner of this legacy, but its steward. It was a trust. With the guidance of Dr. Adams, who extended his stay indefinitely, and using the funds that began to arrive from the East, she started the painstaking work of germination. She built a small cabin on the land Croft had given her, and beside it, a greenhouse with panes of glass, brought in by wagon. The people of Copper Gulch helped. The miners who had once jeered now hauled lumber. The women who had whispered now brought her meals and helped her tend the seedlings. She was no longer the lonely, grieving daughter of a failed prospector. She was Etta Briggs, the botanist. The woman who had seen value where they had only seen rust. Months passed, turning the seasons. The small cabin became a home. The greenhouse became a nursery, filled with rows of thriving green shoots. The final scene of her transformation unfolded one evening at dusk. Etta stood in her new garden, the air cool and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and growing things. Rows of small, healthy plants stretched out before her in the fading light. In one dedicated bed, the copper vein bloom was beginning to show its first buds, the petals tightly furled, promising their unique, metallic sheen. Dust, the old dog, now gray around the muzzle, dozed at her feet, content in this new, peaceful life. Dr. Adams stood beside her, inspecting a leaf through his spectacles. "Your father would be so proud, Etta," he said gently. "He spent his whole life searching the earth for treasure." Etta looked out at the valley, now bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. She reached down and touched one of the unopened buds, a small, perfect promise. "He was just digging in the wrong place," she said quietly. "The real treasure wasn't in the rock. It was growing on top of it all along." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet discovery. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest value is found not in what the world tells you to seek, but in what it teaches you to overlook. If you were moved by Etta's journey of finding worth in the discarded, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll be back soon with the story of a lone blacksmith who forged a legend from a single fallen star.